I stood in the back of the room when Professor Drell Voss wheeled in the display case. It was a long, glass-topped cabinet on a hover platform, the kind museums use to show things they consider important enough to protect, but not important enough to explain properly. The lighting inside was cool and white. It made everything look like evidence. There were maybe 30 cadets in the room. Most of them were Cathani. Tall, four-armed, with smooth gray skin and eyes that picked up light like mirrors. There were a few Sorelians near the front, recognizable by their wide, flat skulls, and the way they always sat slightly too straight, like they were being graded on posture. And then there was me, Cadet Yara Vasquez, human, from a small city in Sonora, Mexico, sitting in the third row of an interstellar military academy on a station orbiting a star that didn't even have a name in my language yet. Professor Drell Voss was the kind of teacher who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, not in an annoying way exactly, more in the way of someone who had been right about things for so long that being right had become his natural resting state. He was older than most of the faculty, with deep lines carved into his face and a slow, deliberate way of moving that made everything he did feel like a formal announcement. He tapped the glass case once, with one long finger, and looked at the class. "Today," he said, "we examine the pre-spaceflight weapons of several civilizations. This is not a combat lesson. This is a history lesson. The distinction matters." He began moving along the case from left to right. The first section held Cathani weapons. Long, elegant, perfectly symmetrical blades designed for their four-armed fighting style. He spoke about them with obvious pride, describing the weight distribution, the engineering principles, the way each one reflected a refined understanding of force and leverage. The class nodded along. I nodded along too, because they were genuinely impressive. The Sorelian section came next. Shorter weapons, dense and compact, built for the way Sorelians fought. Close, fast, using their lower center of gravity as an advantage. Drell Voss described these with respectful neutrality, the tone a professor uses when discussing something he acknowledges but doesn't personally find interesting. Then he reached the human section. I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't quite pride, and it wasn't quite embarrassment. It was the specific feeling of watching someone else try to explain something that belonged to you, using a language they only half understood. The case held 4 items: a longsword with a worn leather grip, a composite recurve bow, unstrung, its limbs curved like a drawn breath, a Bowie knife, heavy-backed, with that distinctive clipped point, and a bolt-action rifle, old and dark and serious, with a wooden stock that had been worn smooth by decades of hands. Drell Voss looked at the items the way a doctor looks at a patient's old chart, professionally, without sentiment. "Human weapons from their pre-spaceflight period," he said. "What we observe here is a consistent pattern of imbalance. The sword is weighted too far forward, making controlled movement difficult. The bow requires excessive force to draw, limiting its practical range of users. The knife geometry is inconsistent, multiple edge angles with no clear singular purpose. And the rifle operates at a rate of fire that would be considered a serious engineering failure by modern standards." He said all of this very calmly, the way you state facts. Someone in the front row, a Cathani cadet whose name I had never learned, made a small sound of agreement. Not rude, just casual. The kind of sound you make when something confirms what you already suspected. I raised my hand. Drell Voss looked at me. "Cadet Vasquez, I have a question," I said. "About the methodology. Go ahead. When you say the sword is imbalanced, what are you comparing it to?" He paused, just briefly. "A properly engineered melee weapon has its center of gravity closer to the grip. This allows for faster directional changes and more precise control." "Right," I said. "That's a dueling sword. That's what you're describing. A weapon built for one-on-one engagements where speed and precision are the primary requirements. That's a specific tool for a specific situation. The longsword in this case does not meet that standard." "No," I said, "because it wasn't built for that situation. It was built for a battlefield. In a prolonged engagement, your grip strength fails. Your arm muscles fatigue. You stop being able to generate force through technique, and you start needing the weapon to carry some of its own momentum." I paused. "The forward weight isn't a mistake. It's a solution to a problem that only becomes visible when you're exhausted and your enemy isn't." The room was quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet. Just the kind of quiet that happens when something unexpected enters a conversation. Drell Voss looked at me for a moment. An interesting perspective, he said, in a tone that was not entirely dismissive. I'm not finished, I said. If that's all right, he gestured for me to continue. I stood up, because what I wanted to say felt wrong to say sitting down. The bow, I said. You described the draw weight as a limitation. 90 pounds of resistance is not a limitation. That resistance is stored energy. When the string releases, that energy transfers to the arrow. The excessive force you're describing is the entire mechanism. It's not a flaw in the design. It is the design. I looked down at it through the glass. And the recurve shape, the way the limbs curve away from the archer when unstrung, that's not decoration. That's physics. It increases the power stroke without increasing the overall length of the bow. A Cathani engineer would call that elegant if it showed up in one of their own designs. A few of the Cathani cadets shifted in their seats, not unhappy, just recalibrating. The draw weight also meant that the people who used these weapons trained for years, I continued. Their bodies changed to accommodate it. The skeleton of a trained archer from that period is identifiable in the historical record. Asymmetric bone density, developed muscle attachment points on the draw arm. They didn't just learn to use the weapon became part of their biology. I paused and looked at Drell Voss. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. I moved on before he could interrupt. The knife, I said. You said the geometry was inconsistent. Multiple edge angles, no singular purpose. I'd describe that differently. I'd say it has one blade geometry that accomplishes 4 tasks. The thick spine gives it enough weight to be used as a chopping tool. The main edge is long enough to function as a general cutting implement. The false edge on the clipped point allows for a piercing stroke that a standard blade geometry can't achieve at that angle, and the finger guard makes it usable as a close-quarters defensive tool when you can't afford the space to swing. I kept my voice even. I wasn't angry. I genuinely wasn't. I just wanted the thing to be understood correctly. That knife was designed by people who knew they might end up somewhere with only one tool and no way to get another one. Every decision in its geometry is an answer to a specific problem. It looks inconsistent because the problems were different, but the solutions all live in the same blade. The room was very quiet now. Even the cadets who had been making small notes on their data pads had stopped. And the rifle, I said. I looked at it through the glass for a moment before I spoke. It was a beautiful object, not in a decorative way, in the way that something is beautiful when it does exactly what it was built to do, without a single unnecessary element. You said the rate of fire is a failure. 1 round, manual operation to chamber the next. In a world of automatic weapons and energy platforms, that sounds primitive. But think about what that constraint forces. Every shot is a decision. You cannot spray. You cannot compensate for poor aim with volume. You acquire your target. You account for distance and wind and movement, and you commit. 1 round, placed correctly, at a distance that the target cannot even perceive you from. I took a breath. There is a recorded engagement from a conflict on Earth's northern continent, several centuries before spaceflight. A single operator, alone, lying in a field for 3 days, using a platform almost identical to the one in this case. The confirmed engagement distance was over 3 kilometers. 3 kilometers, with a chemically propelled round, no targeting computer, no atmospheric correction system, just a person and a tool that demanded complete precision. I looked at Drell Voss. You called it high operator fatigue. I'd call it a weapon that only works when the person holding it is completely present. That's not a flaw. That's a philosophy. The silence in the room lasted long enough that I started to wonder if I had said something wrong. Then Drell Voss did something I did not expect. He pulled a chair out from behind the demonstration table, sat down in it, and looked at me with an expression that was no longer the carefully neutral expression of a professor managing a classroom. It was something more honest than that. You've handled these weapons, he said. It wasn't a question. My uncle had a workshop, I said. He made knives. My grandmother taught me to shoot. I learned archery at school. The sword I only read about, but I read a great deal. He nodded slowly. Then he stood again and looked at the rest of the class. We will continue this lesson in the simulation range, he said. Now. I had not expected that. The simulation range was at the far end of the academy's lower deck. a large room with adjustable walls and programmable target systems. It smelled like ozone and old metal. Most of the cadets had never been in it. The academy's combat training was almost entirely digital. The physical range was technically in the curriculum, but rarely visited, the way some books are technically in a library, but no one ever checks them out. They handed me the longsword replica first. It was weighted accurately, and the moment it settled into my grip, I felt the forward pull of it, familiar, like something I had read about so many times that my hands understood it, without needing to have held it before. The simulation generated a target, a compact combat drone, fast, with armored plating on the front face and a sensor cluster at the top. It was designed for energy weapon cadets, built to test response time and accuracy against a moving target. It came at me quickly. I did not swing at the armor. I stepped to the side, off its direct approach line, and when it turned to follow me, I used that moment, the brief arc of its turning movement, to bring the sword down not in a power swing, but in a controlled falling motion, guiding the forward weight of the blade into the sensor cluster on its back edge. The drone dropped. I set the sword down. Nobody said anything. I picked up the recurve bow next. One of the academy staff had strung it before handing it over, which I was grateful for, because stringing a recurve without a bowstringer is the kind of thing that takes practice to do without embarrassing yourself. I looked down the range. Veth, a Cerelian cadet who had been visibly skeptical during my entire classroom argument, was standing at the far end looking at his datapad. I asked him, politely, to hold it up and stay still. He looked at me with all four of his eyes and held it up. I drew, felt the resistance travel up my arm and into my shoulder, found the anchor point against my jaw, and released. The arrow went through the upper right corner of the datapad. Veth looked at the hole in his datapad. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the hole again. 60 meters, I said. No sight, no rest. I set the bow down and looked at the bolt-action rifle. I didn't pick it up. There wasn't a range long enough in the building to demonstrate what I actually wanted to demonstrate. And besides, I thought the point had been made well enough already. I looked at Drell Voss instead. I wasn't trying to embarrass you, I said. I want you to know that. I know, he said. And then he said something that I hadn't expected at all. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. All right. In 3 frontier engagements over the last 8 years, compact forces encountered environments where standard energy weapons failed. Atmospheric interference in one case, power cell drainage in another, and the third was a close quarters situation in a decommissioned metal facility where half the targeting systems were useless. He paused. We lost people who should not have been lost, because we had built our weapons for optimal conditions. We had engineered out every inefficiency, and the inefficiencies we removed were the ones that would have saved them. He looked at the display case. Your people built contingency into the geometry of a knife, he said quietly. We built perfection, and perfection, as it turns out, has conditions. I stood there for a moment, thinking about my uncle's workshop. The smell of metal filings and machine oil. The way he would look at a blade he was working on and say, with great seriousness, that a tool built for one perfect job was a luxury, and luxuries would get you killed when the situation stopped being perfect. That's the thing about the imbalance, I said. We didn't design around our limitations. We designed with them. We knew we would get tired. We knew we would run out of power. We knew we would end up somewhere cold and dark with one tool and no options. So we built the weight of the sword where it needed to be, when everything else had already gone wrong. I looked at the case one last time. The sword, the bow, the knife, the rifle. None of them perfect, all of them honest. We were never trying to build the best weapon for ideal conditions, I said. We were trying to build the best weapon for the last possible moment. Drell Voss looked at me for a long time. Then he asked me to teach the next session. I said yes.